Thank you. We are going to begin our session today with a word of prayer. We are going to pray with a correct from the Book of Common Prayer. Let us pray. God and Father of all believers, for the glory of your name, multiply by the grace of the Paschal Sacrament the number of your children, that your church may rejoice to see fulfilled your promise to our father Abraham, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Just before we come to our chapter for this afternoon, which is chapter 3, I would like to invite us just to refresh our minds in terms of chapter 2, which we led last week. And so I'm going to open it to all of us. Just throw in a line or two in terms of what you remember, from the story, or rather from last week's story. I want to open this for all of us, 5 minutes, for the whole thing. So you can take a few seconds, just draw in a line or two. Okay, I'm waiting for the people who were here last week. Oh, we have a new group.
Well, just a recap. We had Cain and Abel, Noah, in the ark, after the flood, in the Tower of Babel. So that's what we were going on about or studying. Go ahead.
Cain and Abel, which one was a herd keeper of animals, and which one worked the land?
Cain worked the land, and Abel had the sheep. And Cain, I wasn't here, but I've been taught that Cain knew that he needed to do a blood sacrifice. It's all started in the garden.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So he was trying to make his own rules.
Okay. Are you through with your statement, Mr. Trent? You were saying something?
No, I was just nodding my head. Yep.
Okay. Let's hear something maybe about the ark, about Noah and the ark. Just anything you recall from last week's story.
Well, one of the questions that we didn't get to, I think, was that, at one part, says that told Noah to bring 2 of each, animals. And then he says, oh, wait a minute, no, we want you to bring 7 of the clean animals. But I don't think it was a contradicting of that. I think it was just in addition. They were going to do offerings. So you don't want to offer you don't want to offer a burnt offering of your only 2 samples. It's kind of hard to propagate after that.
Good point.
Okay.
Yeah, I asked this question of Isaac on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
God asked Noah to bring 2 of each animals, clean and unclean, into the ark. And then the first thing that Noah did when he landed the ark was to take 1 of each of the clean animals and sacrifice them to God. And so my question was, did God intend that the animals remain on the earth and propagate and that sort of thing, because that was not the covenant with them? Or did he intend that Noah use those animals to sacrifice to God?
All the above.
Yeah. For
And
me,
then,
Dave,
then Trent's question: How did they propagate after that? When each one of the clean ones was taken, how did the other one propagate?
Well, he told them to bring 7 at the last minute. Hey, bring 7 of those clean guys.
I missed that on page 42.
Maybe that's how we got donkeys.
No doubt.
Mules.
Uh-huh.
I think we're kind of getting a little bit to where Isaac said at the beginning, our first class with the first chapter is sometimes all we can do is kind of beat about the bush and try our best to understand what's going on, which I don't know, that's in a way what I was trying to offer on Sunday is like, well, which God is this, and whose understanding of God is this, and I mean, it's just sort of a big swirl sometimes of our best efforts. Bring 2, no, bring 7, just in case. Those are good numbers. So.
Or maybe they had given birth in the time during the duration of the study.
No, Isaac. What about the Tower of Babel?
Okay, let's go ahead to the next part, the Tower of Babel.
Well, I think it was so. We can kind of look at. You guys are gonna build a tower to heaven. Well, you guys are so stupid. But, like I said last week, it was kind of the new technology. That's what they're gonna use. But we still do that. With our technology today, we think, hey, we're gonna be smarter than God. We're gonna figure it all out. So, and also, God told us to go forth and multiply. Well, they weren't going forth. They were all in one little big group. They're kind of going against what he wanted as well.
This language, building on that, Trent, from this is a book I return to often, The Ladder of Angels. And I had some poetry that we read for the vigil. It's by Madeleine L'Engle. And her phrasing of it is Noah and his family repopulated, and everywhere you went on the face of the earth, you could be understood and you could understand. And then she writes, then a group of men who were clever but not wise, decided to build a tower, not an ordinary tower, but one that would reach all the way up into heavens. And if they could reach the heavens, they reasoned, then they would be God. And the Lord looked at these men who were clever but not wise, proud but not understanding. And it's just kind of, I think she really hits it really well and touches on it, clever but not wise, proud but not necessarily understanding. And it seems to get them and us into trouble, as Trent was observing. So.
Well, what the book implies that, or what I inferred from it, was that the people had become too smart for their own good, if you will.
Uh-huh.
And God didn't like that because they could become better, apparently. And what I heard on the radio today, Oasis, from one of the preachers, was that all the people that were in Babel and built the tower were devil worshippers. Never heard that before. And I didn't get that out of the reading. If anybody has any information about that, as to why God didn't like what they were doing. Obviously, if they were devil worshippers, that would be a problem for him.
Well, I think that sometimes when you look at the Bible, it is parables. It's kind of like, such an example. Come on, you guys! It's so obvious what the message here is, but we wouldn't do that, but we do. But it's kind of we want to get to our definition of heaven, but we don't want to do it on God's terms. We want to do it on our terms. We feel we don't need God, and it's kind of a little short-sighted on us. But to think that somehow we could. Make a name for ourselves and be all that, and we don't need God, and we can be heaven, and God doesn't, we can cheat God out of it.
Yeah, but weren't they building the tower to get closer to God?
They're getting to heaven.
There needed to be more than one language in order to spread the word of God.
Why would that be if they all spoke the same language?
True. I guess, yeah. I guess I look at it in a, yeah, you're right. I guess I look at it and, they were going to repopulate as they grew anyway. But yeah, at that point, yes. But do we know that that's all that existed? Yeah, I'm looking way too into it, I'm sure.
I don't think we know. I mean, it's hard to specifically say everything, all the details down last. And so for me, it's kind of hard to, interesting questions to think about. I think, Dave, when your term of devil worshipers, I mean, maybe, that's kind of back to, your gods for fire, your gods for this, your gods for that. I mean, that was that cultural way. It was just sort of in the water. They lived and breathed. And God calling them to stop doing that was really radical and not their instinct.
I don't know. When I heard it on the radio this morning, I was sort of astounded because I hadn't heard or understood at all that the reason that they were building the tower was because they were devil worshippers. Just amazed me.
Maybe metaphorically, I don't know that I would use that language, but what were they worshiping? They were worshiping not God, but maybe something else. So in that sense,
they were heretics.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I think for on the recapping part, we can stop it at that point so that we can proceed to chapter 3, which is our chapter for today. And just to give a very brief background on one or two aspects, I know Robert Stephanie will pick up another one or two aspects on the background part, and then we will open it up once again. From our previous lesson, that is last week's lesson, we almost unanimously agreed that the book of Genesis was written as a response to the crisis, or rather to the crisis of the exile. Its final composition, we saw and we agreed that it was on or rather during the exile or shortly after the exile. We classified Genesis 1 to 11 as primeval history. But then we come now to the second classification of the book of Genesis, which is chapter 12 all the way to chapter 50. And in this part, we see the stories of the patriarchs and also the introduction of Joseph. In this part, we see recognizable names, recognizable cities, recognizable lands, recognizable geographical landmarks. For instance, now in our case, for chapter 3, we see places like Ur of the Chaldeans, places you can point and say, this is where Ur is. We see the mention of Canaan, the mention of Egypt, the mention of Jordan. These are geographical places and landmarks we can point at. Although strongly associated with Moses, Genesis, and by extension, the 5 books of the Pentateuch, was not or were not penned by Moses per se. However, as an elite guy who was brought up in Pharaoh's court, definitely Moses could have jotted some notes, could have jotted down some notes here and there in the course of his career. And so the composition of this second part were maybe notes jotted down by Moses, and also oral traditions, oral stories passed down passed down, down the generations. If you look, for instance, Exodus 17 and verse 14, we hear God expressly instructing. Exodus 17 and verse 14, God instructing Moses, write down this. And so that tells us Moses was doing some writing here and there, but the whole book cannot be, attributed to him, that he's the one who penned it down. Because like we said last week, this book was written, allowed middle, close to 500, between 600 and 400 BC. And that was long before or long after Moses had disappeared from the scene. If you look at Exodus chapter 34, 27 to 28, we see Moses again rewriting the commandments. And so this guy he could write down. In some places, actually, it is said, like in Deuteronomy 17 and verse 18, you hear Moses being told, write in a scroll and preserve that. And so maybe the writers of these books came across some of the scrolls, written and preserved by Moses. For the children, or rather for the Hebrews to gain relevance in their world's political, economic, and socio-religious matrix, retelling their history from the beginning was very critical. You see, now they are telling the story from their source, from where they believed they came from. Now they have shifted gears to even now bringing in the promises which God had given them. So it's like now they are strengthening their case for their history. The call of Abraham in this case, and he's getting into a covenant with God or with Yahweh, was a part of history which they could not miss out. It was very critical at this point of the exile, or rather during the exile, to deeply ingrain in their systems the fact that the lands they were living in belonged to them by divine allocation. You see, these are people who are in exile. What currently, or in contextual language, we say people who have been forcibly displaced, what we call forceful displacement of populations. People who have been forcibly displaced. And in the course of all this, because we said this book was written to address that crisis, now they had to try and look for something to address them. And so the story of Abraham was very critical to them at this point, because they were like, yes, this land which the Babylonians are taking us from actually belongs to us. It was given to us by God in a covenant. This factor is strategically placed at the beginning of their history as Hebrews. Remember, at the incoming, the incoming of Abraham now introduces these people as Hebrews, because actually it said that Abraham was the first Hebrew, and so now they are trying to consolidate their presence. They are trying to stamp their presence as a people. The changing of names, because in the story we see now Abraham and Sarah, after being taken, after going to Canaan, we see Abraham and Sarah from our story today, God changing their names from Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah. The changing of names historically has been associated to owning and also something like subduing. Take, for instance, the case of Adam. Adam being told by God, again in the same story, Adam being told by God, I've made all these animals, give names to them. And this was like, if Adam gives names to these animals will be under his authority. Remember the case of these guys we called Daniel, the likes of Daniel, Meshach, and Abednego. When they went to Babylon, when they went to serve in the king's court, the king had to change their names. Why? Because changing of names is like, you are under my authority. If I give you a new name, you are now under my authority. And so this was like, now God was stamping his authority on Abraham as his generation. What maybe we can also see something of changing of names. I don't know whether we do it here, but in Africa, there was a time at the onset of Christianization, when the missionaries came in to spread the gospel. At baptism, people had to be given other names, and these names were not African names. Even today, actually, most people don't. It's very odd to hear someone being baptized, with an African name. And so the British came in and told them, we have to baptize you. And for you to be baptized, you have to pick up an English name. And so all Africans who are baptized have English names. Maybe that was a way of the British to see, to try and stamp authority, subdue these people and tell them, yes, we have named you, so you are at the last. Remember also the slavery, the slavery era. When slaves were captured, the first thing a slave master did was to change. Even if the slave had a name, they didn't care about the name. So immediately a slave comes to the household, he had to be, or she had to be given a new name, which now the master will be calling him or her. So this was an area of subduing or owning. And so God changing the names of these people is like, and they are very proud of it, is like, now we are a generation of God. God owns us because he even changed our names. We shift gears again and see the birth of Ishmael still in the story. I want to bring together the birth of Ishmael and the birth of Isaac. Ishmael comes in first, a child of a slave girl, but a child of Abraham. Later on, Isaac comes in. But now, according to the Hebrew story, Isaac is like the legitimate child, is the child, like the legitimate child of Abraham. I mean, because the issue of Ishmael, Isaac, is a very complex scenario, especially in the Middle East, even today. What were they trying to achieve in this? What could be the effect on a colonizer, for instance, remember, these people are in exile. They have been taken captive by the Babylonians. Assuming they want to tell the Babylonians, you know what? You are our brothers because we are from the root of Isaac. But you guys are also our brothers because everyone, came from our father, Abraham. And so maybe you guys are our brothers from the other mother, from the other lady. And so it was like, imagine now a case of a colonizer being told by the person who is being colonized, you know what? After all, you are my brother. And he tries to trickle down back history to prove that. This is something which, at the end of the day, will work towards the one who is telling the story. And so this was a story which could very well work, woven through to try and make these people, the Hebrews, have some space, even in captivity, at least feel that these guys are our brothers. Why don't you treat us well? I mean, we came from the same father, but different mothers. Was it to show that they were legitimate children while others were not? That's a question. Was this put there, for the Jews, for the Hebrews specifically, to show that, yes, we are the legitimate children. We claim our link as the children of the promise. But yes, even the others are children of the promise. So, and at times this has been used to, to accommodate everybody in the matrix of salvation. But maybe by the time the writer of this particular book was putting this in, by the time they were weaving these, these stories together, they were pointing to the future, the bringing together of all humanity under one umbrella, the umbrella of God, one people under God. Maybe, I just said maybe, but I just laid bare a background of the birth of Isaac, the birth of Ishmael, and also the calling of Abraham, and also the renaming of Abraham and Sarah. I want to stop it at that because that was a long history, but try to compress it to a few minutes. I know maybe Reverend Stephanie have something to pick up on another 2 or 3 areas on history still.
Okay, thank you, Isaac. You heard a little bit of the history for those of you who listened to my sermon on Sunday about one way to look at this, specifically with the last part of Abraham offering Isaac as a sacrifice, or that the traditional view, or the unsacrificed or the non-sacrifice of Isaac. So Sue, I don't know if you were at church on Sunday. Usually you are, or you can catch that. There's some source things there. And I'd rather, since we talked about that there, if we have questions around that, I'm certainly happy to engage. There was a couple questions pulling from what Isaac had offered, and perhaps what I had put in the sermon on Sunday, that I thought, Isaac, maybe we could move to the encountering the story with a few questions. I think one of the things is if we could offer the highlights and the low points as we think through are what the pieces of the story we've heard. And the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures is just jam-packed with history and people and characters and just, I mean, there's so much there. So it's amazing that Isaac can offer something as concise and as shortly as he did, because it's a lot. But I think that having heard that and knowing a little bit more of the context, that these stories were written while a group of people were in exile, longing to be back in their promised land and trying to make sense. I mean, they were the writers of the story. So of course we hear Abraham and Isaac's version. We don't really get Hagar and Ishmael's version because it's not their story. You would have to look at another set of sacred scriptures for that, but they're there. So I guess what are the highlights and what are the low points, perhaps? I'm just aware of time and wanting to get some discussion. And then, of course, if there's any specific questions that you all have, go ahead and put those out there too.
Some things that on the story, though, is such the parallels. Well, before I say that, you kind of look in the in Acts and so forth, where they learned so much more, and they had Jesus's wisdom and discernment. They were able to go back and see a lot of things in the Old Testament that maybe made sense in light of that. I do think that you had Moses, who obviously had God's ear, was able to look at some wisdom and so forth, maybe explaining things, maybe some stories and wrapping them up. But the story of Isaac, what always kind of amazed me is the parallels between the story of Jesus. You have it's kind of Abraham and his wife Sarah. There's some old people, kind of a miraculous that they even were able to have a baby. We certainly have with Jesus, that's certainly an amazing conception, there, that both were, God's, son in Abraham's son. He was sacrificing him. And, they're both sacrificed by two very loving fathers. In that they're both, in the same area, in the hills of, I think it's called Moriah, in that same area. It's kind of like, God, something's going to happen, something pretty amazing, a little parallel here. And, they're both considered a sacrificial, lamb. Both of them carried their own wood to their sacrifice. And they both, submitted to that sacrifice. But anyway, there's always kind of, I always sort of was interested in that, the parallels there, but may not mean anything. But anyway, I know it had to be difficult for God, and it was difficult for Abraham as well, to potentially, to lose their son.
Trent, that was a great comparison. I'd never thought of it that way. One of the things that caught my eye was, in reading this, was the point of interest, where it says, in the pagan religions of this time, human sacrifice was not uncommon. In this story, we learned that our God is different from other gods and does not require human sacrifice. Which goes back to, he gave the ultimate sacrifice, God did, when he let Jesus go upon the cross. But there was, and maybe this was a chance for God to say, hey, we're going to change things up. Things are going to be different as we go forward. And so, when you look at both those and you kind of try to compare all of this, it's always interesting how we have the lineage that goes back, when you look at, and that's what all this has to do with, God telling Abram to go and then renaming him. And Isaac, I like the way that you showed how that naming of someone kind of shows that I don't want to use the term ownership, but that loving, embracing sometimes of people that are there. And throughout history, it's been different and has been approached differently. And in these trying times, that's an interesting, perspective to look at everything, because, life is so changing and so dramatic out there that we've got to realize the love that comes from that part of it that God has put out there. Thank you. I'll hand it off.
Yeah.
Another one to consider. Oh, sorry. Another one to consider is we talked about some of the important people, so to say, in the story this week. What are the ones that sometimes we might be tempted to overlook or forget? Or maybe you're less well known?
We don't have very many people to choose from. They're all pretty important. Everyone plays a role at this point. So I would have to really dig into some history to actually see who didn't play an important role right now.
Oh, I'm saying, who are we tempted maybe to overlook? Not that they didn't play an important role, but maybe who is a character or a person that maybe gets a little less airtime, shall we say?
Ishmael's mother and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Ishmael's,
Right.
Or maybe, and maybe even almost the angel, right? That to me anyway, that is in the story with Ishmael, but also with Abraham too. throughout Abram's life. Okay. Yeah. Isaac, you had something to say, I thought.
Well, okay. I was trying to, I think I was at the point of trying to point us, or to maybe to take us to the few questions we had raised from last week. Maybe we can browse through them as we interrogate them. We had a question, one which led, where does this story connect with your life? Where do you hear God speaking in this story to you as an individual, and also God speaking to a community through this story? Maybe we can throw in a few thoughts on that, on each and every question as we progress.
I would add, as people are thinking and contemplating that, the question number 4 on page 38, I think, Isaac, you're right. All of that particular, where does this story connect to, and God speaking as an individual or as a community? As we look at all these questions on page 37 through 38, they're all, that can be put to use to all of those. But one of the things that I was reminded of in preparing for the class this week is that Abraham bargains with God, and it seems like, in a way, and Abraham converses with God and kind of pushes back on God in the story with Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's okay. That's sort of a part of Abraham's role at that point, which I thought was I don't think that I don't know. I just think for me, sometimes it's easy that hadn't registered as deeply as it did this time, to say that there's evidence of that where, Abraham is in a dialogue and is really trying to understand God's justice and God's mercy. And I think Abraham is also kind of getting to know God as well throughout all of this. When I just think about Abraham's encounter with God, this God who sends him out over the desert, and and off he goes. They're constantly learning about each other through that process and through that journey. And so we see a different part of that when Abraham is in dialogue with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, which is kind of, I think, the second to last little section that we read. Yeah, on page, not midway through. Yeah, on page 33. And so I was just reminded in studying that wasn't like a confrontational, is viewed, at least by scholars, not as a confrontational, like that Abraham is out of his place, but that it was okay. He was, God seemed to, at least in the story of the telling of the story we hear, that it seems all is well. So.
I think I would say, across the scriptures, we have seen people of faith bargaining or arguing with God for their case, and even bargaining seriously to a point where you would seem like these people are pushing God a little bit too far. Mm-hmm. For instance, this reminds me of a judge who was called Gideon. I think he was one of the judges during the judges' times. We know the story of Gideon, who was being told by God, I will do this. But then he had to be very sure that, well, are you sure, God, of what you are saying? You have to give me a surety, a real surety, something I can see, something tangible. I mean, to a point of even putting some wall outside and telling God, if I come up tomorrow morning and there is no dew on this piece of skin, then I'll know you talk to me. And he didn't even bargain once. Even the following day, he changed. He twisted the story and told him, now I'll leave it out. And now I want to see the reverse of it, the other side. And God was very patient in terms of, letting him argue to and forth with him to a point of now, and I don't think that challenged Gideon's faith. At times I think arguing or bargaining with God does not challenge our faith, or does not show us to be people of retro faith. I would say I've done it severally. I would say I've done it severally. Cases where I have to tell God, now, this is the case, God. I remember there was a time I could take a seat and put it down, have a seat and then put an empty seat on the other side and assume that God is on that seat, and I had to have a conversation with him, try to tell him, you see, God, after all, this is your work. This is your ministry. It has nothing to do with me. Why are you pushing me so hard? I mean, why are you? And at the end of the day, I've seen God coming through in many circumstances in my life. So at times I think arguing and bargaining with God and even pressing him to the wall, there are psalms which we call psalms of disorientation, psalms where we could see the writers of the various psalms, really pushing God to the wall and asking him, why would you allow these? People at times maybe who were hurt, they felt God was involved in their getting hurt, and they have to corner him. And so I think that that is me. I think that doesn't challenge my faith. That doesn't portray me as someone of retro faith. And I also think, I would say maybe in the current context, in the times whereby we are having a lot of teachings, right, left, and center on different things, where do we know that this is the voice of God? I think a time like this, we need to bargain with God at times like Gideon. I mean, tell him, I need a second reassurance that truly this is you in this case or in the other case. So yeah, I don't think it challenges my faith. That is me.
I think, you look at with your children or your grandkids, and they have questions and they're kind of innocent, and the answer, but you kind of you go along with them, and you're helping them grow and so forth. God wants to have a relationship with us, and if that's what we need, a little more reassurance, and if the wool's going to be dry one day and then it's going to be wet the other, if that's what it takes, God's patient with us. He wants us to bring us along. God knew how many worthy or lack of worthy people were in Gomorrah. He knew it. That conversation and that conversation, we all know it. He where he was going with it and so forth, but he needed to come along. So, when we think about things and we question and we don't really get quite an angel talking to us directly, but we do get to hear, discernment and so forth. Sometimes we have to ask those questions and then and to be able to have better understanding. So, God wants that relationship with us, and if that's what it takes a little bit, and he'll be patient with us. So it's okay to question if it's gonna bring us along.
Yeah, but do we think that Abraham had a special relationship with God? First of all, as Isaac has said, God changed Abraham's name, made him special in that regard. He took Abraham through a crisis of faith when he told Abraham to take Isaac to the mountain and sacrifice him. He was almost like the other gods that accepted personal sacrifices, human sacrifices at that point in time, until the angel came. And then God made his covenant with Abraham. So did Abraham have a special relationship with God that allowed him to argue? I mean, we talk about having a dialogue with God, but I don't think that dialogue in our definition today is an argument with God the way that Abraham argued. And maybe Abraham felt elevated to a certain position where he could argue with God. And what was he arguing about? He was really developing God's mercy as part of the argument. No, I'm gonna do away with the whole city. No, I'll do away with everybody except 50. No, I'll ultimately do away with everybody except one, if I could find one, or 10. And but still, Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt. But did Abraham have a different relationship with God than we all have, because of the trials, because of the special name changing and all the rest of that stuff?
We think now that there are people living now that have that same possible special relationship, because I can see where you're coming from, Dave. So I wonder if there are people now that have that same sense of special relationship.
It's the arguing that gets to me, where Abraham also almost puts himself on the same level as God in order to argue with him. That to me is special. I don't think any of us today assume that we're going to argue with God about anything.
I have.
And I don't mean not liking what he's done or allowed to happen or anything like that, but arguing for him to change it, and then God actually acceding to the argument and changing it. So I just feel that Abraham was special in that regard, much more special than perhaps the rest of us.
And maybe that simply goes back to, yes, I agree with you, Dave. And maybe it goes back to, this is setting a precedence for the rest of the world from this day forward. So maybe that's why we're still looking at Abraham today. Maybe that's why he still plays such an important role. So maybe he argued for the rest of us back then. And no, we don't argue with him now. We may, and argue is not really the word I'm looking for. Negotiate, maybe. Argue. I'm not exactly sure, but maybe that relationship had to be special in order for us to have that same sense of a special relationship.
On Facebook, Bob Chapman, he mentioned though that, Jacob wrestled with God, and, so there's definitely lots of cases where, we wrestle with God sometimes.
Yeah.
Sue was saying something. You're through with what you're saying?
On Facebook, Bob Chapman is watching on Facebook, and he had mentioned that. He also shared, in Isaiah, I think, which you talked about it this Sunday, of, what good to me your multiple sacrifices, and so forth. And he also shared, hang on one second. Anyway, I guess that's it.
Dave, it sounds like this is something that challenges you this week about this story in ways. I thought I heard Sue saying that you have argued with God or bargained or had stern I don't know.
All of the above. All of the above identify with the way that Abraham was talking to God, you know, and the whole bargaining, arguing. I mean, that's kind of a typical thing with me and my relationship to God. So I think it's more a type that God was showing us what a relationship with Him could be. That He expects us not to. I mean, we're great about saying that with Episcopal Church. We don't put our brain at the door. You know, we can still confront Him with our questions.
Right. And if you think about it from a parental perspective, I wouldn't want my child not to be able to ask questions or to kind of ask for clarification, and obviously at times push back, because then I'm not sort of allowing the fullest expression of who they are and guiding them as to how do you do that in a way that is appropriate and fruitful, maybe.
The thing that was fascinating to me is to read this section about as Abram pleads for the people in Sodom and Gomorrah, and but then the whole transfer with his, when it was time to sacrifice his son, he didn't question that. By that time, he didn't argue with God. He understood that you know, by the power of the Holy Spirit, I guess, that yes, this is not to be argued. So that to me, that's an interesting, you know, two sides of the same relationship. But in the first one, he's arguing. In the second one, I mean, God had been dealing with him, obviously, about sacrificing his son. But as he took him, and it was quite a distance that they went, and he marched on. He didn't stop and argue then. So.
Well, I think I would also pick it up from Dave's point of, from where Dave stopped. Was Abraham, an elevated kind of person? I would say yes, and with a reason. We started the story at the calling. God called Abraham to himself, to become his. And when Abraham becomes God's, he's owned by God to a point of God now changing his name, to make sure that he truly belongs to him. And I think from the point of the calling, all of us who are called to be God's children have a place. I would say third, but I start to be corrected. I think all of us who are called to be God's children have a place in terms of bargaining with God, arguing with God, and even at times, I would say, look at it this way. For instance, the prayers we pray. Do we change the mind of God with our prayers? We don't know. Maybe we do change the mind of God a lot of times. Maybe we pray for someone who was destined maybe to die, and we pray for them and they come back to life and they continue with life. Who knows? So maybe because we don't know the mind of God, maybe in many instances, in our interactions with God, we bargain with him and he changes with his mind. But because we didn't know his initial mind, or even the mind he's thinking right now, we don't know whether we have changed it or not. Again, elevation in this case, I look at it from the point of Abraham was an ordinary human being. Actually, we can say a sinner. I didn't want to go this direction, but look at this case. a guy who even, this might look not very good, a guy who even trades his wife, if I could use those words, a guy who even trades his wife to gain favors from, from the king, from Pharaoh, because actually that's what it was.
His sister.
Mhm.
And he lied.
He says, "This is my sister." Maybe Pharaoh paid dowry. I don't know whether maybe Pharaoh even paid bride price to
Some questionable things going on there.
And at the end of the day, the guy made a lot of money, and by the time he was leaving Egypt, he was a rich guy, to a point where now they were colliding with Lot because they had a lot of property. I mean, this is someone who we can say was a sinner par excellence, but yes, elevated to a point of bargaining with God because of the calling. And so I think the calling here is very, very key, because that's actually where we started, the call of Abraham. And so any one of us, because we are called to God, we are called by God to be his children. Yes, we are sinners, but again, we are elevated. If I would use Dave's words, we are somehow elevated because we have given a leeway. We are given a leeway to communicate directly with God through, of course, as Christians, through his son, Jesus Christ. Because we believe that any intervention we want God to intervene and we go through Jesus Christ, he hears us. And so I would look at it that way, a sinner elevated because of the calling.
I would add also to that, Isaac, thank you, that Abram was just an ordinary, like you said, person who miraculously was called and almost sort of plucked out of nowhere and sent off on this journey to do these amazing things that, like, chronologically in his years and for Sarah weren't even possible. And so I think to me, it just shows God's desires. One of the things it shows is God's desires over and over to use the sort of people and humanity that we are. And that's sort of echoed in that God brings Jesus into the world in the lowliest way that one could be, in the most sort of scandalous way that one could be human. And yet it does amazing and miraculous things on the world are set in motion with that. But it's all the time. It's like, it seems like to me, one of the meta themes is that God is using the calling, not pristine people. And Abraham certainly, or Abram at the time, and Abraham by the time he left, certainly, was not a pristine person. He had a pretty amazing relationship with God and had learned to listen, but he certainly didn't start there.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think, God uses us, just an ordinary person a lot of times to do some amazing things, sometimes a little mustard seed, we think it's got to be some big thing, but can use us. But, if we let him, if we're quiet enough, maybe we're not gonna, each one of us has touched other people. And sometimes if we just be quiet and let God use us to God has a bigger plan that is bigger than us. But if we just let him, help carry out his plan, his kingdom here on earth. And meanwhile, I think Bob Chapman's he's given us a whole bunch of different other ones with arguing with God. I think he mentioned in Acts, Peter, God had to tell him 3 times, don't be arguing. And I think he had Jonah and Moses also question God, but their heart and their motives were right. They just sometimes just got a little sidetracked.
Peter also, even with Jesus, gives him some suggestions that Jesus is not particularly happy about and tells him, "Get behind me," right?
Yeah.
Get behind
God
me.
used them though to carry that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And yet Peter's the rock. I mean, for maybe a number of reasons.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob.
I think so often we tend to forget that God tests us all the time, and he's tested everybody. I mean, look at Job. I mean, the whole part of Job is the testing, and going through and proving yourself to the Lord. It's never easy to do that. And it's easy, to say, well, hey, God, if you do this, I'll do that, and, you always hear, the stories that no one finds religion until they're in a disaster and they need it. And sometimes that's true, but the other side of that is that God's always listening. He's always there. He has an open heart. Now, can he be a very harsh individual? Well, when you read the Bible, definitely. There is a harsh side to that. There's the reality of things that have happened throughout history, and a lot of it can be proven by history. And that's what's so great about the Bible, is that there's so much in it that we question, but at the same time, there's so much in it that can be proven scientifically. And that's the great thing about it, in believing in the Lord Jesus Christ and in God, and how they come into each and every one of our lives differently, and how we can touch others with our faith and belief.
One of my daily devotions, and I'll make this really quick. God willingly enters into our daily lives, for this is the God of the incarnation, the God of life who joins us on earth. God willingly relates to us as we wash the dishes, work in the office, travel back and forth, collect the children, work for charity, buy a lamp. For this is the God who gave Jesus to us, the God who sent the beloved Son to live with us. God willingly speaks in time and space, for this is the God who is creator. And all things, time, space, people, are the creatures of his hand.
Very good. Thank you, Kimmy.
Yeah, that was very, 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 very pretty, very nice.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think for the interest of time, I want to propose that we look at the next steps. We are not going to read them, but just look at the next steps, which are on page 38. Maybe in the course of next week, even as you read through chapter 4, because like we said, you're going to read through chapter 4, and then you come and do the same thing. Also read the 3 points or rather do what the 3 points say in page 38, which are the next steps. And now, at this point, I want to again call upon our vicar to maybe give us the closing remarks and also give us the benediction.
Thank you. Thank you, Isaac. Yes, this next chapter is this next section is a little longer than what we've read previously. So look at the questions, the next steps, and the questions going forward. Some familiar names and faces and experiences, and let's go with that. I would just did it just fly out of my brain? I think it did. I had something I was wanting to note. That's okay. Let's stick with the questions. And I think, I know what it was. Do we have a volunteer who would be willing to recap this week's story for next week for like 5 minutes? It'd be like 5 minutes or less to start us out, so that we don't do a kind of a group part, but that you would offer it just very briefly, a paragraph, if that. You can write it and read it. You can have your notes and tell us. But it's really important when we're working with Scripture as a part to more deeply internalize the stories, is to retell them in our own words. And so we'll all get to have some practice at that. And we're actually, as a group, collectively retelling the story. We'll retell the high points of the story together with chapter 4 for next week, together as a group. But what I'm looking for is someone, I think Isaac and I really value this, to have one person but retell it in their own words to start us out this chapter 3 for next week.
I'll volunteer.
Okay. Wonderful, Jaime. Okay. All right. Okay. So I think with that, that is what we have. Let me grab I have a prayer, one of my favorite ones that we come to is out of evening prayer, and let me get to it here. Okay. All right. The Lord be with you.
And also
with you.
Lord Jesus, stay with us, for evening is at hand and the day has passed. Be our companion in the way. Kindle our hearts and awaken hope, that we may know you as you are revealed in Scripture and in the breaking of bread. We grant this for the sake of your love, and our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
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 Thank you, Isaac.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you all.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Stay cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.